sources as well, like Aristophanes and, of course, philosophical sources like Plato in his Symposium, in Ion, and so on and so forth. Why was he picked up by Monteverdi? Well, I think that in order to answer this question, we should remember that the first opera that was ever composed was Daphne, followed by Eurydice, and there had to be a response by the Duke of Mantua to, let's say, the Camerata of Florence, and therefore we had the creation of Orpheus. The opera was based on the Greek legend of Orpheus, and tells the story of his descent to Hades and his fruitless attempt to bring his dead bride Eurydice back to the living world. I should note here that it was composed by Claudio Monteverdi, which was probably the most innovative and imaginative composer of his time. He was born in Cremona, and he was trained in music at the local capella. By 1590, he was a recognized musician. His successful composition of madrigals, like those found in his 8 Libro de Madrigali, made him a renowned musician. He was able, therefore, to enter the service of Vincenzo Gonzaga, under whose auspices he composed this favola musicale that we'll be talking about. He also composed many other works, like Incoronazione di Poppea, Il ritorno di Ulisse in Patria, and many others that have been lost, like Le Noce di Tecli di Peleo, Le Noce di Enia in Lavinia. Let's talk now about the opera, or l'Orfeo. What are the 3 major concepts that we find in the opera? We find the moment when man realizes that he can say no to death and resolve to change his fate. The power of love to transform is another major theme, and the power of music to persuade the unwilling. Here you see a wonderful relief from Musée du Louvre, which shows Orpheus leading Eurydice under the auspices of Hermes from the underworld. Here you see Christ depicted as Orpheus in Rome, in a fresco from the 4th century. And here, from a detail from a chair at the Byzantine Museum. Which were the characters of the opera? They were la musica, music, la messaggera, speranza, hope, Charon, Apollo, shepherds and nymphs, and a chorus of spirits. Let's now listen to the prologue, the Sinfonia, which is also called the Toccata from Monteverdi's Orfeo, which will introduce us to the opera, and then we'll focus on specific extracts from the opera that you have in front of you. So, in the opera's first act, we see an invocation to the muse. In a similar fashion that we see that Homer actually invokes the muse at the beginning of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And shortly after, we are transported to another context. But let's view a small part of this introduction, where la musica, the personification of music, introduces the subject briefly. And shortly after, she introduces the subject of the opera, the Myth of Orpheus. Let's now move on to what happens after that. We're shortly transported due to constraints of time. I'd love to show larger parts of the opera, but time constrains us. So we're shortly transported after that to a pastoral context where shepherds celebrate the festive occasion of the marriage of Orpheus and Eurydice. Let's listen to a small extract from that scene. Orpheus is finally happy. He has found his wife. He rejoices. And that's how it feels in the opera. You have the text in front of you if you want to have a look. In the second act of the opera, we have an announcement by Messaggero, the messenger, that Eurydice is dead. And Orpheus, inconsolable, bursts into a lyrical lament beginning with the word oime, which is typical within the context of thrimos, lamentation, as already seen from speeches of Andromache in the Iliad. I want to particularly note that we hear the word coming from Orpheus' mouth, and this has been associated, according to Sternfield, with a reminiscing echo lament, which can already be observed in Euripides in his lost play Andromeda, but also in Perry's echo lament, and also in the Florentine Intermedi of 1589. So let's listen to that extract where the messenger arrives and informs us that Eurydice is dead. Let's pay particular attention to the word oime, which I think is really a crucial point, as it shows the continuation of language from archaic times to modern times. Words that can't be translated into Italian. Let's go straight to the moment of the announcement, the messenger. Listen to Orfeo. Description of the scene of Eurydice's death, bitten by a snake, as she was walking to garlands in the garden. And let's now listen to Orpheus' lament. This is entitled Tu sei morta in the opera. It sort of ends with a climactic moment where Orpheus says farewell forever to the world above and descends to the world below in the final attempt to save his beloved from death itself. In the third act of the opera, we see Orpheus reaching the banks of the river Styx, a river in the realm of Hades, the underworld, and attempting to convince Charon that he is dead. In his attempt to achieve that, he sings the famous aria Possente Spirito, with which he manages to make Charon sleep, and hence manages to descend even further into the depths of the underworld. Let's listen to this aria. In the fourth act, Orpheus finds himself already in Hades, where Persephone herself gives him the soul of Eurydice. In the end, however, Orpheus cannot restrain himself and looks at Eurydice, violating the divine decree and resulting to the eventual loss of Eurydice forever. In the opera's fifth act, Apollo descends from the skies and takes Orpheus up with him in the heavens, offering him immortality, saliam cantando al cielo, whereby he teaches Orpheus the value of virtue and self-restraint. Let's look at this final climactic moment of the opera. And here we have the wonderful duet of Apollo and Orpheus ascending to heaven. He asks if he will ever see again the sweet eyes of Eurydice, and of course the response is that in the beauty of the stars and the constellations you will, in the beauty of the cosmos, which is a very Neoplatonic concept. Here we go. Saliam cantando al cielo. let us end with a couple of remarks on the concept of reference to Apollo. We know that in a lost play of Aeschylus in the 5th century, entitled Lycurgia, Orpheus, after his catabasis, neglects the worship of Dionysus and instead honors the sun, whom he identifies as Apollo. However, in the sequel of that trilogy, in the Bacerids in English, we see that eventually Orpheus is dismembered. And that is closer to the first ending that Monteverdi chose in his 1607 edition of Orfeo. However, in the 1609 edition, that he much preferred and that we saw right now, we do see an ending where Apollo plays a great role. And even though that isn't apparent in ancient sources, in the Lycurgia, in Aeschylus, in the 5th century, it is apparent in Eratosthenes, where we see that after the death of Orpheus, there is some kind of apotheosis whereby his lyre becomes a constellation. And we do see a similar story in Boccaccio, Giovanni Boccaccio, who is a major poetic source for the Renaissance, and it's much closer actually to the libretto of Alessandro Strigio, which is the libretto of l'Orfeo, of the 1609 Orfeo, and of course the 1607 Orfeo. And I find that particularly important to note because you do see how the Renaissance sources have a direct influence in the work of art that is produced during the time of early Baroque. And also, I would just like to note that it is through this final ascent that we learn the concept of virtue, which is a concept that is really related to Christianity as well. And as Strigio points out in the end of his 1609 version, thus fares the one who shrinks not at the call of the eternal Spirit. Thus grace in heaven obtains the one who here below made trial of hell, and he who sows amidst sorrows of every grace shall reap the fruit. Thank you very much for your attention.